Welcome everybody to our session today. We are going to be dealing with the Black Money Act, or the Black Money and Undisclosed Foreign Income and Assets and Imposition of Tax Act. This act was introduced in 2015 in the wake of the government's crackdown on corruption and money stored abroad. Um, Subsequent to a number of information leaks over the world and a lot of scams being exposed, where a lot of high net worth individuals in India were found to have income and assets stored abroad. And the focus of the government at the time, and that has been codified in this act, was to address how this undisclosed income that is lying abroad can be identified and how it can be brought to tax under Indian laws, while understanding the limitations that are there in the current Income Tax Act. Of course, there were parallel measures to strengthen information exchange between countries through negotiation of tax treaties, many of which are still underway. And we have been seeing how the provisions on information exchange and recovery of taxes have been, being renegotiated between countries and are becoming more and more, more and more stringent by the day. The express object of the Black Money Act itself is to address the problem of black money that is lying undisclosed and to provide for a procedure to deal with this black money once it is, disclosed to Indian authorities. It's important to note that the procedure provides for an assessment, levy of tax and penalties, but it does not actually require such income to be brought back or repatriated to India. However, one has to also take into consideration the fact that the levy of tax and penalty under the Black Money Act is as high as 120% of the income or asset value. And so in a way, it can be argued that the government has already recuperated the amount. We know that as of December 2019, as per newspaper reports, at least 400 cases, notices were issued under the Black Money Act, and an amount of at least 12,000 crores was under assessment under the Black Money Act. This is aside from the prosecution notices that have been issued. I'm going to jump here to Shipra to take us through the provisions of the Act and to tell us what is the charge of tax that is envisioned under the Act and who is an assessee for the purposes of the Black Money Act.
Thank you, Varsha. So, like Varsha mentioned, the Black Money Act is a separate legislation. It is separate from the Income Tax Act. Having said that, the scheme of the Act is very similar to the Income Tax Act in the sense that there is a charging provision, there is a computation provision, there are provisions dealing with tax administration and appeals process, so on and so forth. I think, like Varsha has already mentioned, the tax rate per se is fairly high. 30% is the tax on the is the income tax, and 90% is the penalties. The tax as such is levied on undisclosed foreign income as well as the value of the asset. To provide some context, the Act was introduced back in 2015, and at that point in time, the government also introduced a one-time compliance window. Under this window, taxpayers could disclose their undisclosed foreign income and assets by a certain date, in which case a lesser penalty was applicable. So instead of the 90% penalty, a 30% penalty was levied in that cases. It also provided immunity in terms of further taxation under the Income Tax Act, the Wealth Tax Act, compounding under Foreign Exchange Management Act, and certain other acts. Having said that, I think the way we looked at it was that the response per se of this one-time compliance window was fairly lukewarm, and taxpayers didn't really come out in the numbers that the tax department was expecting to sort of disclose their foreign. So just to, step back, and before we look into the provisions of the Act, one important thing that probably taxpayers are concerned with is in respect of how does the tax department really really get information regarding these assets and this income. So like Varsha was mentioning, there are robust treaties and arrangements with different countries that India has entered into. Of course, there are double taxation avoidance agreements. There are also tax information exchange agreements with jurisdictions which are considered as tax havens, like BVI or a Cayman entity, under which information can be sought by Indian tax authorities regarding residents of India and their foreign income and assets. Right, so these are the various ways in which the tax department can sort of get an idea of undisclosed income. The other, I think, way, at least we've seen in the past, is that there are provisions, or there are disclosure requirements under the income tax returns as well, where residents have to disclose their interest in foreign entities. For example, if you're a beneficiary of a foreign trust, or if you have signing authorities to say bank accounts of a foreign company, and so on and so forth. So I think what we've seen that in the past, tax department has come back and said that we do see this disclosure made regarding a foreign asset you hold. So please give us more details. And they have sort of also given notices under the Black Money Act when such disclosures have come about in the income tax returns of the taxpayer. Now, I think just to move forward to understand who is a taxpayer under the Black Money Act. Yeah, so the term assessee has been defined under Section 2(2) of the Black Money Act. Prior to 2019, the definition was restricted to a resident of India. Resident could include both individuals as well as other persons or other corporate entities. In 2019, the government essentially amended this definition to include persons who have been resident in the past. So essentially, the act is today applicable to non-residents who were at some point in time resident in India, and at such point in time, they had, say, undisclosed income relating to an undisclosed asset which was acquired while they were tax resident. So essentially, the scope of the term assessee has also been increased to include non-residents per se. Moving on to what exactly is the scope of taxation under the Black Money Act. So when we're looking at what really is amenable to tax under the Act, there are two things, right? One is the undisclosed foreign income, and second is the value of the undisclosed foreign asset. Undisclosed foreign income essentially has been defined under the Act to include income from sources outside India which have not been disclosed in the income tax returns that have been filed by the assessee in India, or if the assessee hasn't filed income tax returns at all and such returns had to be filed, then even in that case, the undisclosed foreign income comes into play. Further, it does not really include any variations to income from foreign sources. For example, under transfer pricing, etc., if there is a variation to your foreign income, that is not included as undisclosed foreign income. I think moving on to the next definition, which is what is an undisclosed foreign asset. I think this is the interesting one because I think there are three elements to an undisclosed foreign asset. Firstly, it has to be an asset located outside India. An asset also includes financial interest in any entity. So, for example, if the taxpayer says has debentures or shares in a BVI entity, that could also be an asset. Second is that such asset is held by the taxpayer in his name, or of which he is a beneficial owner. Now, beneficial owner as such has not been defined under the Black Money Act. But having said that, there is a definition of beneficial owner under the Income Tax Act, which as per, I think, Section 215 of the Black Money Act would come into play. And this definition is very wide to mean in the sense that it includes essentially any person who has contributed directly or indirectly or provided a consideration for such asset. So the definition of beneficial owner is wide in the sense to the extent that any consideration has been paid by the taxpayer to acquire this asset, he could be regarded as a beneficial owner. And the third aspect of the definition is that the taxpayer has no explanation about the source of investment in such asset, or the explanation given by him is, in the opinion of the assessing officer, unsatisfactory. Now, I think here is where there is an issue in the sense that the scope of what is taxed under Black Money Act is also dependent upon an opinion or the discretion of a tax officer. So the scope itself isn't clear, and this is what we feel could give rise to issues considering the amount of subjectivity involved within the definition of what can be regarded as an undisclosed asset. So that's as far as the definitions are concerned. Moving on to the charging provision, which is section 3 of the Act. Essentially, I think like we've already discussed, there is a 30% tax on the income arising from the undisclosed asset as well as the value of the asset. There are certain rules prescribed to sort of value the asset. So that's as far as the charge of tax is concerned. Also, I think importantly, what section 5 talks about is how the tax has to be computed. Unlike in the case of income tax, where deductions can be sought under section 37 and things like that, here there is no deduction or with respect to any expenditure or allowance or any set off that is allowed when you're looking at the payment of taxes. Secondly, there is no provision really insofar as claiming foreign credits and things like that. So, for example, if income taxes have been paid abroad, there is very little room to sort of foreign tax credit in India. What the section does provide for is that if income taxes have been paid in respect of this income, to that extent, you would not be paying taxes under the Black Money Act. So that sort of relief has been provided under section 5. Specific to immovable property, I think what the Act says is that if, for example, part of the income which was used to acquire a certain asset has been subject to taxes, then your Black Money Act, your charge of tax under the Black Money Act would be sort of proportionate to the undisclosed portion of amounts that you pay to acquire the asset. So I think that clarity has been provided insofar as immovable property is concerned. Moving on to what is the scope and validity of the Act in terms of timelines. So while we discussed the Act came into play in 2015, it is applicable from assessment year 2016 onwards. However, essentially, there is a provision under the Black Money Act which specifically says that if there is an asset which has been acquired prior to the commencement of the Act and no declaration in that respect has been made, then in that case, such asset shall be deemed to have been acquired in the year in which the assessing officer issues a notice. So essentially what this means is that if, say, a taxpayer acquired an asset in, say, 1990, and such asset was never disclosed, and the tax officer issues a notice in, say, 2020, you could still sort of be liable to pay taxes despite the fact that the Act per se came into validity or came into effect only from 2016. So, Varsha, you have any thoughts on how courts will look at this aspect in terms of time limitation?
Shipra, thanks for that. I think this question of retrospectivity is something that has been brought in and challenged in a number of decisions. However, we are yet to see a very concrete decision. a lot of the challenges on retrospectivity arise from the Article 20 of the Constitution, which basically provides for protection against conviction in a retrospective manner. Basically, under the Constitution, you can't be convicted under a law that wasn't in place at the point of time that the offense was committed. Um, Now, this one of the cases where this was brought in very clearly and discussed was a Calcutta High Court decision in Shivardhan Mohta, and the decision came out recently in 2019, where the court pretty much just brushes past this issue in a lot of ways, because it says that even after the Black Money Act was introduced, there was that disclosure window that the assessee in that case did not take advantage of. And so the court said that in that case, there was no question of even looking into retrospectivity. Interestingly, the court also examined the second limb of Article 20 of the Constitution, which talks about double jeopardy, which again is a concern that is raised because the Black Money Act provisions, as we'll discuss in a bit, do have harsh, consequences of criminal consequences under them of imprisonment and fines. And there are arguments to say that similar offense can be caught under the IT Act, under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, as well as the Black Money Act. And is there actually any protection against the same offense being picked up under all three? And the answer is no. And the court kind of also just looks past this issue here, saying that there are no parallel provisions under the IT Act which provide for imprisonment. So we don't really have a very conclusive view on these. We understand that the recent judgment of the Supreme Court in the Gautam Khaitan case actually delves into some of these issues. But there as well, the court doesn't actually go into a very detailed discussion, saying that it's for the High Court in that case where the case was set aside back to the Delhi High Court, which would have to look into these provisions in these issues in more detail. So yeah, we know that these issues have been brought up before courts and are under challenge, but any very conclusive opinion on these remains to be seen. But what can be seen and what can be assessed is the language of courts in respect of Black Money Act disputes has been quite harsh and strict. There is a very underlying understanding that the provisions of the Act are punitive in nature. And even considering that the very base of the provisions deal with undisclosed income and assets, um, sort of indicates that these are assets and income that A should have been disclosed in the first place, and hence is already a violation of law. And B, since the government did give an amnesty in the disclosure window, there seems to be an underlying understanding that even if despite such a disclosure window, a taxpayer didn't actually avail of it, then there are concerns and perhaps the benefit of doubt does not really go to a taxpayer in such a case. But yeah, the questions still remain open, Shipra.
Understood. So I think, like you said, one issue is, of course, in terms of what is the time limit and the retrospective applicability of the Black Money Act. I think the second issue is also in terms of, like you said, the Black Money Act is punitive, and the assumption is sort of against the taxpayer, because the taxpayer, like you said, is assumed to have already disclosed it because such disclosure was required under law. But having said that, there is a high level of discretion still available with the tax officer in terms of how to determine whether or not an asset is an undisclosed asset or not, because it's not just mere non-disclosure that leads to that result. It is also if the assessing officer finds that the reasons provided by the taxpayer are not satisfactory, such a conclusion can be made. So, I mean, just to understand what sort of powers does the assessing officer have under the Black Money Act, and just to understand what is the scheme in terms of the procedure that is available once your notice has been issued by the assessing officer. Vasha, your views on that?
Shipra, before we go into that, I saw a couple of questions that kind of go in line with what you were just saying on the assessing officer's satisfaction of an explanation by an assessee. And Rahul has asked if an assessee can explain the source of investment in a satisfactory manner, will it still be considered undisclosed foreign asset? And I think that's exactly what we were discussing, Rahul. And thanks for that question. Um, the key point here kind of seems to be the fact that the criterion and the standard is the satisfaction of the assessing officer. So yes, if it's explained in a satisfactory manner to the tax officer that this the source of this income or used was a legitimate source of income, then it still may not be an issue. But like Shipra just said, the term satisfactory is really wide. There are no guidelines as to what would amount to a satisfactory explanation. We also don't have enough jurisprudence at this time to know exactly what that standard of satisfaction is or should be. So again, the short answer is yes, if it is explained satisfactorily, then it's not an issue, but we don't know what satisfactory really can amount to. So, jumping back to the powers of an assessing officer and the income tax authorities, there are, like Shipra already mentioned, there are a lot of similarities between the Income Tax Act and the Black Money Act. And these similarities are there in a much more stark manner when you talk about the machinery provisions of the Black Money Act. And to put it succinctly, the Black Money Act pretty much borrows the machinery and administrative setup that is already there under the Income Tax Act. Um, the income tax authorities that have jurisdiction over a taxpayer under the Income Tax Act also have jurisdiction under the Black Money Act over that taxpayer. And that income tax authority also has powers under the Civil Procedure Code, similar to the powers under the Income Tax Act, to enforce attendance of an individual or before the court, to issue summons to compel the production of documents, and powers for discovery and inspection of documents. Um, the Black Money Act says that the income tax authority concerned can also impound and retain books of accounts. Interestingly, it only requires reasons to be recorded and to seek approval of a senior officer if for retention more than 30 days. If that assessing officer is of a rank below a commissioner, otherwise, there seem to be no reason requirement to record reasons for impounding and retaining the books of accounts and documents. Again, there are criminal consequences under the IPC for certain actions under the BM Act, such as intentional fabrication or providing any false evidence, or any insult or interruption to a tax officer, which is also subject to fine and simple imprisonment under the IPC. The assessment process and the appeal process again is very, very similar to the Income Tax Act. Shipra discussed this in detail about the basis that can form, the reasons for issuing notice under the Black Money Act. And this basis can be anything pretty much. These can be information received from income tax authorities, information received from other authorities, what we know as leaks of information, and also information availed under information exchange programs with other countries through automatic exchanges or through bilateral treaties. The BM Act, interestingly, actually says that any information obtained by an assessing officer for purposes of income tax, this means returns, any other information, documents filed before the income tax officer, can be used by an assessing officer under the Black Money Act, meaning that you may not need to file those information afresh. And an assessee would also not be then able to claim that certain information was not furnished before that officer. So how could they have used that information? The timelines prescribed are 2 years from the end of the year in which the notice is issued to complete that assessment. The Act also provides for a best judgment assessment scenario, which is if an assessee does not cooperate in providing information, the assessing officer is free to make that assessment while exercising their best judgment. As you can see, there's a general trend of provisions, etc., which sort of make it more worthwhile or actually try and incentivize the cooperation by a taxpayer. And similar would be the case when we look at the offences section as well. There are powers of rectification as well, and there is also a provision to allow for a direct assessment on a beneficiary. So, for instance, like we saw in the charge of tax, undisclosed income and undisclosed foreign asset can also include income or assets in respect of which that assessee is not the beneficial owner, but is the legal owner of that asset. In such a case, the Black Money Act also allows for a direct assessment on the beneficiary. Again, the appeal process is also similar to the Income Tax Act. First appeal lies to the Commissioner of Income Tax, second appeal to the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, then to the High Court, and then to the Supreme Court. And the provisions are pretty much in pari materia with the Income Tax Act. So a lot of the timelines and also the criterion such as, there needing to be a question of law to actually approach the High Court also apply in the Black Money Act scenario. Now we come to the tax recovery bit, which is once you have an assessment and you have a tax demand under the Black Money Act finalized against a taxpayer, how can the tax officer actually recover that tax? Like in the case of income tax, a notice of demand needs to be issued to the assessee, and this notice of demand is statutorily it says 30 days payment period. It can be reduced or extended on the assessing officer's will. And it can also be extended on request by the assessee if they can make out a good enough case as to why there should be an extension. On expiry of this period that's prescribed, the assessee pretty much becomes an assessee in default, which means that any coercive measures or measures to actually recover the tax can then be initiated by the officer. We've listed down a few of the ways in which the tax can actually be recovered from the assessee in such cases. The assessing officer in such a case is actually permitted to require an employer to deduct such an amount from the salaries payable to an employee. Similarly, any other debtor can also be required to pay over whatever amount they owe to the assessee. If the debtor feels that they have a good basis to say as to why they either don't owe that money to the assessee, can't pay it over, or any other reason, they can actually appeal to the tax officer. But if they just don't pay, they can also be proceeded against as if they are an assessee in default either. The assessing officer can actually also go to a court saying any money that's lying with them that they're holding in custody for the assessee should be paid over to the income tax department to meet this tax liability. You also have attachment and sale of property as per the second schedule of the IT Act. Again, exactly the same process they're under. And you also, interestingly, have the 281B process, which is a provisional attachment, which essentially empowers an assessing officer to provisionally attach the assets of an assessee if they are under the impression that the taxpayer will flee for some reason, or they will not be able to recover, or they will, just transfer the assets that they have so as to not pay the tax later. In case of a company in liquidation, the Black Money Act provides for the income tax department to actually have a charge on the assets after employee dues and secured creditors, again, similar to the Income Tax Act provisions. Now, in case the assessee is sitting in another country, how does the income tax department in India actually go ahead and recover any taxes from an assessee sitting outside of India? Well, of course, they can try and attach any property that the assessee actually has in India. Sometimes this can be in the form of bank accounts or shares that the foreign entity or an individual holds in India, or even seize immovable property. But there's also a way to actually go and request the government of that foreign country to use their mechanisms to recover taxes from that individual or company. And these usually go by procedures under double tax treaties, where competent authorities of both countries will, get together and invoke the recovery mechanisms of the foreign country. Like I mentioned earlier, a number of treaties are being renegotiated to strengthen these provisions currently. I've mentioned the India-Spain treaty because the notification of the protocol amending that treaty kind of was focused on strengthening the information exchange and recovery provisions. And they actually go to lowering the bar of in respect of information that needs to be exchanged. So while the treaty earlier said that only information that was necessary in respect of a tax claim needed to be exchanged under the treaty, the bar is now lowered enough to say information that is foreseeably relevant also needs to be exchanged under the tax treaty. And a lot of these obligations are now couched in mandatory language under tax treaties, not really leaving much up to the other government. And countries are signing up to these treaties, which means that concerns such as these are obviously global, and each country wants to sort of secure their rights to such information. There's also stricter protection of exchange information currently, considering all the general the sensitivity around data being leaked, and that is also another avenue through which the other country would be incentivized further to actually share that information with a different country. So this was about information sharing, but even the tax recovery provisions have become stronger under tax treaties. And like I said, a lot of the obligations are now couched in mandatory ways, in which that other country will need to put into force, put into work their own recovery provisions under that taxpayer if India actually approaches them in respect of a claim which is enforceable under Indian law. So Shipra mentioned the penalty under the main penalty under the Black Money Act, which is the 90% penalty. And of course, we're talking about all of this after the disclosure window, since the disclosure window is now over and done with. The penalty being 90% and the charge of tax being 30% actually brings the entire due to the income tax department up to 120% of the value, which means the income tax authorities and the Indian government recover more than the value of the income itself. Of course, this is quite punitive. But even apart from that, there are other smaller penalties, such as penalties for non-filing or inaccurate filing of details and income, and also penalties for default and payment of tax arrears, and penalties for other defaults, such as not answering a question that the income tax department is asking you, not signing a statement that you've been asked to sign, and not just not turning up or not producing the documents you've been asked of. The non-filing and inaccurate filing penalties apply in respect of residents who are required to file under 139 of the Income Tax Act. Naturally, it applies in respect of income from foreign sources or foreign assets, which is the ambit and the scope of the Black Money Act itself. Offences and prosecution portion of the Black Money Act are actually quite rigorous, going up to 10 years imprisonment in case of willful attempt to evade taxes and penalties or interest. There are two categories of offences that I can say. One category talks about imprisonment up to 7 years, which includes willful failure to file an income tax return, willful failure to furnish information about foreign income or assets, knowingly making a false statement in a verification, and knowingly abetting or inducing someone else to make a false statement. And the like we just spoke about it, the 10-year offense in this case goes up to a willful attempt to evade taxes, penalties, and interest. And it includes cases where a person is controlling books of accounts or causes some false statement to be made, etc., and essentially does anything that causes this evasion to happen. So, yeah. We know that under the Income Tax Act, there is a presumption of culpable mental state against the assessee, and that presumption comes up in the black money context as well. So it's not for the department or the assessing officer to prove that there is mens rea. It is actually for the taxpayer to prove to the contrary. And in fact, this argument of mens rea was brought up before the Calcutta High Court in the Shivardhan Mohta case that we just discussed a bit earlier. And the court refused to deal with the mens rea aspect there altogether, saying that this was an aspect that was relevant for criminal proceedings, and the subject matter needed to be determined by a criminal court. So again, not an aspect that we have much jurisprudence on in the black money context currently. Interestingly, the Black Money Act offences have also been included in the schedule of the PMLA, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. And hence it's also suspected that this could lead to an invocation of proceedings under the PMLA. In which case, then it will be interesting to note whether the double jeopardy proceedings provisions do actually come into play, and how they're dealt with, and how courts will uphold, that constitutional principle. We already spoke of Article 20 a while ago. The twin requirements of Article 20 being that you cannot actually have someone, subject to criminal law, which wasn't in place at the time that the offense was committed, or where the consequence of committing that offense was not as high at that time. So, for instance, if the offense was committed at a time where the punishment was lower, which was later made higher, you can't have that higher punishment on that person. And also the double jeopardy requirement that we just discussed. So yeah, Shipra, going to put it back to you if you have something to add on these.
Sure. So I think in terms of procedure and penalties, etc., I think one interesting point you mentioned was that the assessment can also be on beneficiaries of an asset. Now, just that also sort of ties into who is a beneficial owner and who is a beneficiary. Because I think when we're looking at the applicability of Black Money Act, I mean, it's most likely the applicability is going to be practically on individuals. So, I mean, just taking a structure which is an offshore structure, which is a common sort of asset planning structure, which is that of a trust. So, if there is a trust in, say, a foreign jurisdiction, and a resident or an assessee under the Black Money Act is, say, a beneficiary of that foreign trust. Then I think the question comes up as to whether the beneficiary, has whether by virtue of just being a beneficiary of that foreign trust, would the Black Money Act provisions apply or not? I think the question deserves some sort of thought, because as far as trusts are concerned, there could be, two kinds of trust insofar as the beneficiaries are concerned, which is that where the beneficiaries are known and their shares are determined or ascertainable, which is like a determinate trust. And the second kind of trusts are discretionary trusts, where essentially the trustee has the discretion to distribute income to a certain class of beneficiaries. The beneficiaries may or may not even be aware that they are a beneficiary of a discretionary trust. So, I mean, in these circumstances, the question comes up as to whether a beneficiary of a discretionary trust would really be subject to the provisions of the Black Money Act or not. I think this question also comes up when we look at disclosures under the income tax returns. There, of course, I think the stance or the conservative position that people take, and that's still an open issue, is that if you're aware that you are a beneficiary of a discretionary trust, it is best to disclose. But when you're looking at applicability of Black Money Act to such a situation, again, the kind of actions, the kind of punitive measures that are there in the Black Money Act, would it be fair for such provisions to be applicable to a beneficiary of a discretionary trust who, for all is not even aware that he's a beneficiary of a discretionary trust? So I think that's a question that we feel may come up in future. Do you have something to add to that?
No, Shipra, nothing to add, but an interesting point that you bring up, and I think it's been subject to a lot of discussion by commentators. Again, one view that seems to emerge also is that if you're a beneficiary of a discretionary trust, can you really say that the income has arisen to you up till the time that there is a distribution? Again, this is on the basis of the Commissioner of Wealth Tax cases, that the line of cases that we've had previously under the income tax and wealth tax law. But again, like Shipra said, these are arguments that can be taken. These are conjectures at this point. Provisions remain untested, and we don't know how they'll actually be taken up and used in the context of trusts. And it would actually be interesting to see how courts implement them. Shipra, would you like to take up one of the questions? We have two questions, I think, presently, which remain unanswered.
Sure. I think yeah. So I think one question, asked by Mr. Sunny is a very interesting one. He asks whether how would relief under double taxation avoidance agreement be available if you're charged to tax under the Black Money Act. So I think this is again a very subjective point, because as such, if you look at it, the power to use the treaty or take control of the treaty comes under the Income Tax Act. The Black Money Act is a separate legislation, and the purpose is very different from from double tax avoidance, right? You're looking at income which has never been disclosed in India and has been earned abroad, right? So I think the purpose of the two legislations are very different, in the sense that if you have already paid income taxes abroad, then in that case, in all possibility, your income is not undisclosed, or you are able to provide a satisfactory response to the assessing officer. So this whole issue will probably not arise. I think the way the government is looking at it is that if you don't have sufficient reason afforded in terms of how you earned this income and how you acquired a certain asset, that's when the Black Money Act will come into play. And given that the right to go under a treaty is available under Section 90 of the Income Tax Act, we would still sort of need to see how and when whether Income Tax Act Section 90 would even apply to the Black Money Act or not. So that's still a question that's remains to be seen how it's going to sort of.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Shipra, I think one telling, I mean, while we don't have a very clear answer to that in the provisions itself, one telling kind of provision is that there are certain provisions of the Income Tax Act that have been incorporated into the Black Money Act. And the Black Money Act actually says, subclauses C and D of Section 90, subclause 1, which talk about information exchange and recovery. So it's very clearly just not applying the double tax relief portions of Section 90 and 90A. So again, of course, whether the treaty itself applies or not, and whether the Black Money Act is completely outside the ambit of the Income Tax Act or not, these are questions that remain open. But yeah, it does seem that the intention of the legislature at this stage is to not provide that benefit. Again, goes back to our point of how this provision and this piece of legislation is incredibly punitive in nature. The very fact of its the name of the act itself is imposition of tax on undisclosed foreign income. So if and you can see it in the decisions of the high courts and Supreme Court that have come out, just the manner in which courts are dealing with these cases. The underlying sentiment is that it is in fact a taxpayer who's come to a court with unclean hands, so to say, and hence isn't actually entitled to deductions, set-offs, foreign tax credit, etc. So again, short answer to Sunny's question, in my opinion, would be that foreign tax credit under double tax treaties may not be allowed, even if tax on that income is paid, it has been paid in that other country. The other question that Rahul has raised is whether income which is being charged under the BM Act can also be charged under the IT Act, and if you can have parallel assessment. So the answer to that is no, because the Black Money Act very clearly has a provision that says if income that has already been assessed or is assessable under the Income Tax Act, it can't form part of the undisclosed income under the Black Money Act. So to that extent, at least the legislature has tried to avoid any overlap or very obvious duplication in terms of accessibility.
I think just some, I think concluding thoughts from my end would be that the Black Money Act today, I mean, the legislative intent is of course a novel one. Having said that, the way the act is structured, there are certain issues with it, starting from who is a taxpayer. Today, after the 2019 amendment, even a non-resident who used to be a resident at some point in time could come within the purview of the act. So that's one thing. How does that play out in terms of jurisdiction to tax? So that's one point. The second point, of course, like Varsha was discussing, was in terms of what is the limitation, what is the time barring in terms of Black Money Act. Again, that's also a very high threshold where you could technically go back all the way up to say 1980 and tax somebody on the value of the asset acquired back then and income arising from that asset as well. So those are questions that come up, and while the Black Money Act is a punitive act, it still begs us to see whether or not it sort of stands the test of law going forward.
Thanks,
What
Shipra.
are your thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think I kind of echo your thoughts on these as well. I mean, we all know that the Income Tax Act has changed in form and size substantially over the years because of numerous amendments. Many of them brought in because of judicial decisions, and many of them, of course, brought in due to policy changes. Compared to that, of course, the Black Money Act is a really new legislation comparatively. And so, of course, the provisions are at this point at a stage where there are questions. and there are open issues. But like with every other piece of legislation in our country, it's likely to be changed, and there's likely to be settled jurisprudence on this as time goes by. And hence, what we understand of the Black Money Act today and of the rights and obligations of taxpayers under the Black Money Act as it stands right now, um, are definitely subject to change and are subject to evolution over time. Shipra, anything to add?
No, nothing else to add. We can conclude the session if there are no further questions.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining in, and thank you for the questions. They've been engaging and they've been interesting to answer. We really hope you enjoyed the session, and we hope it was engaging for you as well.